We've already seen in earlier tutorials how our alphas can help us with our sculpting. Let's see how we can create our own custom alpha. To do this, I'm going to start over in my tool palette. I'll click on the tool icon and select a cone 3D. I'll click and drag to draw that into the center of my canvas, and then I'll click Edit. I'll move up to Make Polymesh 3D. And once I've converted this into a Polymesh 3D, I'm going to hold down the Control key and tap D a few times so that I can divide this to give myself a little bit more resolution to sculpt with. I have the standard 3D brush selected, and I'll simply hold down the Alt key and start carving into the surface. Now that I've done some initial sculpting, let's make this a little bit more interesting. I'll select my blob brush from my 3D brush palette, change my stroke over to spray, and then I'll tap the S key so I can take my draw size down a bit. Again, I'm going to hold down Alt. Once you have the surface looking the way you want, we can move on to painting some additional pixels inside our scene. To do this, I'm going to click on the Simple Brush. Now when I click on the Simple Brush, you're going to get this dialog box, which is essentially asking you if you want to drop this to canvas or put it back in a 2.5D state. I'm going to click Switch, and now this is dropped to canvas. But at this point, we'll hit Control N. Now we haven't gotten rid of the cone that we were just working with. You'll notice that it's been loaded right here in our user-defined meshes. So with the Simple Brush selected and a round alpha, I'll simply paint in a few pixels into my canvas. I'm going to stay away from the edges, that way we can have a nice fall off when we create our alpha. And just like we did with our cone, let's make this a bit more interesting. So again, under Stroke, I'll click Spray, and then I'll change my alpha. Maybe to something like Alpha 22. Again, I'll hold down Alt so I can carve into the surface. Take my intensity slider up a bit. Good. Now that we've painted those pixels, let's bring our cone back. Again, in the tool palette, I'll click on the tool icon, and now I'll click on the cone I've sculpted earlier. Once I've selected that cone, I'll simply click and drag into my canvas. Now you notice that we drew our cone in, but it's drawn in kind of sideways. That's because it's paying attention to the normals of the pixels underneath. I'll click Edit, and simply click in an empty area so that I can position this cone a bit better. Now that that's positioned, again I'll click Edit to drop it to 2.5D state, and then click Move. In this Move state, I'll simply click in an empty area. I'll click and pull towards me. As I do that, we're pulling it out from the underlining pixels. So you can sink it back as far as you want or pull it forward. I'll just get it blended in with the surface. I'm going to click Edit twice, once to put it in 3D and once to drop it back into 2.5D. And then I'll blend these two surfaces a bit better. So again, I'll change my stroke over to Spray, and my alpha over to the same alpha I used earlier. Now before you start sculpting, make sure you're on your Simple Brush. If we were to sculpt right now, we'd actually draw in a lot of cones, and we don't want to do that. So let's switch over to Simple Brush. Again, I'll hold down Alt, and I'll kind of just carve up this surface a bit, just to get it to match. And now we're done with everything we need to do right before we create our alpha. Now to create the alpha, I'm going to use a tool called MRGBZ Grabber, and that's again in our tool palette. This will grab material, color, depth information. With this tool selected, I'll start in the middle and click and drag to make a selection around the pixels I've drawn in my canvas. You notice once I do that, over in our alpha palette, we have a new alpha. This is the depth information of what we've drawn in here, which we can now use as an alpha to sculpt. So let's go ahead and grab a character that we can work with. I'll switch my brush over to my standard brush. I'll switch my stroke over to drag rectangle, and then alpha over to that newly created alpha. I'll click and drag on the character. Now you notice we don't really see quite the same elevation that we did when we were working. That has to do with our intensity slider. So I'm going to hit Control Z to undo that. Take my intensity slider up a bit, and then again click and drag. And now you've created your own custom alpha that you can work with. So your intensity slider has great control over how this alpha will affect the surface. So we can just add some random kind of noise here. Or you can turn it way up and create horns like this. Don't forget you can also turn this intensity slider up, hold down the Alt key, and then push into the surface. So if we wanted to make a gaping hole in the back of this guy's head, we could. All from the pixels that we drew down earlier.